Welcome everybody to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. I realize it's been over a week since we've done a live stream, so it's good to be with you all again. Also, just take a minute and especially because it has been a little bit of time, like the video, share the channel or share the conversation with other folks, make sure people know. I will say one thing, we're doing the dual streaming thing today, which I know can be a little bit weird on the tech side. So there is a landscape and a portrait version of this conversation, and it's designed that way. Like on YouTube, there is obviously folks are also watching us on Instagram and on Twitter. But if you're on YouTube, there's one that's more designed for your phone, supposedly, which is the portrait one. And there's one that's more designed for televisions, and you can decide which one. But if you're in one and you don't like the way it is arranged, then just go back to the Millennials channel and select the other feed. So I just wanted to say that up front before we get into this conversation, which I am, really looking forward to. It's always hard to express like excitement about discussion around such difficult, topics as talking about this ongoing genocide, which just continues to get, uh, you know, explore the depths of depravity of humanity in a lot of ways, and certainly of imperialism, right, and Zionist settler colonialism. And we haven't yet done a discussion yet of the UN Security Council resolution that happened last week, that we will have to do something more sustained about soon. But this is a conversation that I think is a really important one. It's about a book called Terms of Servitude, which we're going to discuss with the author Omar Zahzah. And it connects to the conversations that we've been having with Dwayne Monroe around digital technology and, so-called artificial intelligence, obviously, but it also just connects into obviously all the platforms that we're streaming this conversation on right now, and to the kind of role that social media and these, streaming services and things like this have in, what Omar calls digital settler colonialism, which we'll talk about today, which I think is a really interesting framework. And the book is very interesting. It's very accessible. It's basically, a lot of, it's kind of a journalistic, like a movement journalistic art, book. And I'm sure Dr. Zahzah will talk a little bit about his process of putting it together today. So let me introduce him. So Omar Zahzah is a writer, poet, artist, musician, freelance journalist, and assistant professor of Arab, Muslim, Ethnicities and Diasporas studies in the Department of Race and Resistance Studies at San Francisco State University. Very interesting department with some really cool colleagues. And some folks might remember a conversation, two-part audio conversation we had a couple of years ago with Cesar Che Rodriguez, who also is a professor there, and I think maybe in the same program. But Omar is an organizer for Palestinian liberation for over 10 years. He is the former Education and Advocacy Coordinator for Eyewitness Palestine, which I'm sure a lot of you know, a role that saw him training delegates to Palestine on Palestinian political history and culture and social and racial justice. Omar's writings on Palestine have appeared in outlets such as the Electronic Intifada, Mondoweiss, Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, The Nation, and the New York Times. And Omar holds a PhD in comparative literature from UCLA. So without further ado, Omar, I'm going to welcome you to the stage. Thanks for joining us today. It's good to be with you.
Thanks so much for having me. Happy to be here. And I think I need to say now for posterity, since the boycott has been gaining steam and I believe in it, I need to strike the New York Times from my bio for all time from this point forward.
It's so funny you said that. I almost made some kind of snide remark when I read it, but like
you should have. Yeah. We could have double teamed, but yeah, no, it's.
I join you. For sure.
The
Yeah,
boycott.
and so anyways, just welcome. It's good to be with you. I appreciate all the work that you're doing. I look forward to kind of talking about all this stuff with you because it intersects with a variety of my own interests as well as some of the work that we do here. But we haven't actually really talked with a scholar or a journalist like yourself that is focusing on these issues specifically with respect to Palestine. And obviously, you touch on things in the book throughout the book that we're all painfully aware of, right? Which is
Mm,
like the censorship regime on these apps and the constant fear. I was re-listening to your interview with Nora Barros Friedman and Ali Obenima on Electronic Intifada and talking about having videos taken down and dealing with all that stuff, and we haven't been hit too hard so far. I don't really know why, and these are some of the contradictions that you wonder is like, do sometimes maybe these platforms also want content related to Palestine because they know people watch it or they know people click it and like it and all of that,
right.
but they also constantly, suppress things, shadow ban, ban users, including people that you talk to in the book and people that we've had on our platform as well. You talk to Nerdine from Within Our Lifetime, and Sammy Dune takes up a part of the book, and
Yeah.
many of these kind of things. And so it's really just an interesting read. And like I said, to folks to start, it's a very accessible read too. Like it's not an academic book in a sense of, like you have to, sort through a lot of jargon and you're kind of trying to do a lot of really high theoretical kind of academic labor within it. Obviously, it has this theory of digital settler colonialism, which kind of ties it together. But really, it's a journalistic book, I would say, more than anything. So yeah, I mean, why don't we just start? Why don't you just say a little bit about, kind of, um, what drew you into it? I guess you have this story. We could start with this that, um, of writing the pitch for it, it getting accepted, and then, the genocide really commencing in full force, and you just couldn't write, which like I totally understand. And it's amazing that you actually, I think, were able to finish it, during the genocide because, um, I relate to this a lot. Just the like, kind of the difficulty of working through language and even reading has been very difficult for me over the last couple of years. Just taking the time and the space to do that. Um, but, you talk about being reminded by comrades in Palestine who would ask you for feedback on, different things they were dealing with and, getting help with their analysis and stuff like that. And so, that you talked about recognizing the importance of, the kind of work that you were doing in that moment. So talk a little bit about kind of this, so, what I've laid out there and what kind of took you on the journey for this project and led you to this concept of digital settler colonialism?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. It's it's a great question, and I think I like that you kind of set up so many different points in it because you kind of reminded me that it was a longer journey than sometimes I even remember because you just get into the exercise of kind of giving the 2 minute spiel of how it came together. But what really happened, I'd say everything started actually even before the book manuscript and obviously before October 7th and before this latest genocide. Um, in 2021, around May 2021, I started to take notice of the activism of Palestinians from Sheikh Jarrah, the occupied East Jerusalem neighborhood, and particularly how much their resistance to their like looming displacements by the Israeli state was also drawing on social media as a form of communication and as a form of basically expression of resistance. And also drawn in by this seeming contradiction of how, on the one hand, they were getting this virality and it was seeming to have an impact on broader discourse, even corporate legacy media discourse around Palestine. And even as it starts to affect some of these shifts in terms of how people are talking about Palestine, representing Palestine, you start to see the platforms that had made those forms of expression possible really start to become arch censors of those forms of expression. And it was interesting because I think we've always thought of the legacy media, right, as being very, especially like the hegemonic legacy media, let's say, as being a very anti-Palestinian force, right, and as really predicated upon the elimination of the Palestinian narrative. I don't think there was necessarily a total trust in social media, but there was still this assumption and this branding that social media was to some extent an alternative space, right, where you could find expression for things that were excluded from the mainstream. And so when you started to see these companies at such a massive scale really acting as, censors of the very types of speech practices that they had kind of built themselves as representing, you start to have this really interesting contradiction that kind of sat with me. There was another incident too. You may recall in first 2020 and then again in 2021, there was Zoom, the video conferencing platform, censored in open classroom by the Palestinian feminist professor Rabab Abdulhadi and Tomomi Kinokawa in Women and Gender Studies in San Francisco State that featured the Palestinian liberation icon Layla Khalid. And they did this twice, again, because first, they tried to do their own open classroom, through the AMED studies program. And then again, there was an attempt to redo that conversation in collaboration with the University of California, UC Merced, I believe. And that also got censored again by Zoom. And of course, we found out, or we realized not too shortly after the fact, or even during the moment actually, but that this censorship was prompted by massive kind of Zionist troll campaigns, right? There was this now defunct app called ACT-IL, which some of your listeners may remember, but it's basically this app that encourages its users to go on various missions, quote unquote. So it kind of gamifies, undertaking various opposition to Palestinian programmings as kind of like quests or side quests. And so one of the missions that the users got was to make sure that Zoom was outreach to was protested to make sure that this classroom got shut down. So there was, it was kind of both of those things. And with the open classroom, you also had YouTube and you had Facebook, and Facebook deleted the AMED Studies page for at least a year before it got restored, thanks to the work of the tireless advocacy of Dr. Abdulhadi and all of her supporters, as well as digital rights organizations that continue to petition to get it back, right? So it's kind of, sitting with all of these things, like seeing all of these different examples of, on the one hand, you have these platforms that are touted as these, countercultural, these sort of alternative spaces that are actually acting as censors of, Palestinian liberation-focused expression. And so that kind of sat with me, and I thought about how there had been, by this point in time already, a lot of, I think, a steady amount of works that were dedicated to thinking about how does big tech, for all of its branding, really actually re-entrench the very systems of oppression and subjugation that it claims to be able to work against, things like white supremacy, patriarchy, anti-Black racism. And we've had, I think, a lot of really important studies dedicated to that topic, but kind of sitting, I think, sandwiched between all of these seeming examples of how, the writing is really on the wall. It kind of got me to think that there isn't necessarily an elaboration in kind of a broader context for the Palestinian case. And I thought it was really important to start to try to provide some broader collective language for how we can understand what's happening. And so that's where the idea of trying to codify digital settler colonialism came from. And, I make it clear in the book, I'm not the one who coined that term. I draw on other thinkers. But I realized it was important because, precisely as you were saying, even in your introduction, like so many people that you've interviewed have gone through exactly the same thing. And you even mentioned, well, I think we're all familiar with this, right? And it kind of got me to thinking that this is happening on such a massive scale. So many people are experiencing it. Sometimes it's even kind of uneven. So there's this unpredictable quality to it. But for the most part, you know that you need to brace yourself for some kind of suppression, whatever that looks like when you're navigating, these hegemonic platforms, these now hegemonic platforms. And so what I was trying to do in the book was really to provide kind of a collective language that would help all of us make sense of our experiences. Not just for the sake of inventing a term. I was talking to another friend who's an academic, and she said, like, we have this thing called, I call this syndrome, where we're always like inventing words out of nowhere, and sometimes it's kind of silly. But in this case, I thought that it's really important to make sure that all of the examples of the ways that these companies clearly re-entrench the censorship of Palestine-focused expression, or use their status to really streamline the facilitation of Israeli colonialism, occupation, and genocide. All of those really are at root the same issue. And so I wanted to try to provide collective language that would help us denounce this on whatever scale we're experiencing it, and understand that all of these things are interlinked. Not even in the sense that I'm from on high bestowing some great understanding, but more so rather to give credit to what people have already been naming and trying to resist. But when I had, some of my first inclinations about this kind of led me to write a piece for Al Jazeera. And at that time, I talked about digital apartheid, and in the book, I kind of continue on with this story too, of realizing that after a certain point, apartheid felt like an insufficient framework because it just wasn't capacious enough. Apartheid is one aspect of the Zionist project, but the truth of the totality really is settler colonialism. And so that's what kind of helped me to move toward a more expansive term to try to make sense of all of these things that we're experiencing. But then, so I pitched the manuscript, before this latest genocide even begins. And in fact, based on some writing that I had already done prior to that point. And so I always think of the book as having been the product of two somewhat distinct moments in time, because even with the Sheikh Jarrah moment that led to the Unity Intifada, there was still a lot of repression, but there was also this sense that I think some of us had felt that the narrative was really shifting, and that some kind of change was inevitable. And that could just be my idealism, but nevertheless, it still felt like this was a little bit different from what we're seeing now, where the patterns of repression that were first being rolled out, and maybe even rolled out a little bit awkwardly in that phase, were now being increasingly streamlined and locked down upon, right? Like they're digging in their heels, basically. So if I had to guess, I would say that's one of the main distinctions, because we're seeing the same forms of suppression, but I think the distinction is that now they're really being normalized, they're really being locked in, and the companies are very unapologetic about it, right? Even going so far as to explicitly codify their decisions to censor Palestinians, through their community standards, which we could talk more about. But after the genocide, this latest genocide began, I did find myself in this moment thinking, well, I don't know if I can really continue, because it just felt weird to write and to do an individual project like that when the most important thing really felt to be to continue going out to demonstrations, or to supporting different initiatives for Palestinians in Gaza, and really just decentering yourself, and putting the emphasis on the collective efforts that people are trying to undertake. But I think it was a combination of things. One of them was definitely just realizing that, this wasn't going to end anytime soon. And I don't want to speak for anybody else, but I think I won't say the same feeling, but kind of a connected feeling where, like, there's this sense that if people could just see the extent of the atrocities, then there's going to be like a broad intervention, right? Because obviously nobody can allow this to continue. And obviously that wasn't the case. And then seeing that even when, the international community had just made this explicitly clear that there really wasn't going to be, a large scale action undertaken, that, we're going to get some optics for the most part. But then, obviously the US, then under the Biden administration, really just locking and going in gun-ho, doing nothing to stop it, you realize, like, okay, well, then it's really up to everybody, the people to uplift the resistance in Palestine, but all of us to do whatever we can, wherever we are, to, also amplify these efforts to continue to resist the genocide and to advocate for Palestinian liberation. I think that sense kind of brought me back to, well, where are we all located? What can we do from where we are? And so in my case, I did have this manuscript that I had, pitched and I had stopped working on. But then also, as you mentioned, I had some comrades who were reaching out to me from the West Bank and working on articles and saying, like, can you give us some feedback on this? And I thought, well, if you're really in many ways at the heart of the side of suppression and you're continuing to work on it, right? The West Bank has also been undergoing, massive, intense pogroms as well. And I was like, well, if that's the case, then, it stands to reason that it's not that, analysis itself is passé. It's more so like, how are we doing it and what are the reasons, that we're releasing it and what are our intentions? And I think that was kind of a reminder that, like, again, like, if your platform or your space is the analysis that you're working on, maybe there is a way to do it where you're really trying to uplift the broader collective effort of what people are doing to really, again, denounce and resist and ultimately stop the genocide. Not that you're doing it, but you're uplifting all of the efforts to do so, and also to advocate for Palestinian liberation, which is our duty, always wherever we are. That kind of got me to thinking, okay, maybe there's a way to finish this, and of course it's going to be changed because I think everything and all of us have been changed by what's been happening. And, that's arguably a good thing. We wouldn't want to be exactly the same people we were before all of this. But that's what convinced me, okay, let's finish this and let's try to do it in the best and most intentional way that I can. And I think a part of it too was, again, this idea that, it's not everything, but having some kind of a collective framework for what we're experiencing and trying to resist. And also exposing how some of the things that we take for granted as being very quotidian or being kind of meaningless or pointless, because we're all on these platforms on some level, like showing how actually these things are not really benign, or they're not silly, or they're not just, foolish. Like, they actually are, part of this broader colonial process. Like, kind of reminding us of that, I think is, something that it's important to do. So I guess that's the answer, or part of the answer to your question of, like, how I continue to do this.
Yeah, right on. No, thank you for laying all that out. There's a question I want to ask about, like, the history of resisting silencing and erasure, but I'm going to come back to that because I think that's a really important point, and I think it's a in certain ways a hopeful point as well, which I think we need to a certain extent. But I want to actually take a minute and talk a little bit about, give you a chance to talk a little bit about how you set up digital settler colonialism too, because I think that anytime we talk about settler colonialism, there are a lot of variants of how people talk about this within the theory world too, particularly academics, I'm thinking. And, sometimes it can seem like it's kind of, I'm thinking in part of Max Isles' work of sometimes he talks about, a critique of the way people can talk about settler colonialism as if it's like shorn off and independent, like it's its own thing, right? So Zionists in that sort of, framework, right, would be kind of the core responsible party, and then they go out in other parts of the world and seek support and so on, et cetera, rather than you use a framework really in the book that does center Western imperialism as kind of fundamental and really important to obviously to Zionist settler colonialism, but also to kind of understanding a convergence, I think, of interests here, right? So talk a little bit about the convergence model you use. And just to give an example, like many folks have noted how there are many prominent Israelis, often coming out of Unit 8200 of Israeli intelligence, that are working for all of these platforms, the ones that we're streaming on right now, right? And they have very prominent roles quite often. And, as well as many other Silicon Valley companies. And so, people, this always sort of begs questions here of what is the relationship? Why, right? And so I'm curious about kind of that question, I realize there's sort of two questions there, but it's sort of like the question of, how do you kind of structure when you're thinking about this, the relationships between, things like, Western imperialism, monopoly capitalism and its, tech industry, right? And, the prominence of like these Israeli intelligence actors within these spaces.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that, because that's, I had mentioned earlier that I'm not the first person to use the term digital settler colonialism, but part of what I try to do in the book is really emphasize how what we're experiencing directly and what we're seeing play out is really the result of an active collaboration between the primarily U.S. Big tech sector and the Israeli project. And to a certain extent, this is not surprising, and it's basically continuous because Zionism, has always relied upon Western imperialism, to for its success. Ultimately, we saw that with Great Britain, and now you have the U.S. as the primary partner and benefactor, although the Western states by and large, and also some kind of shamefully complicit states in the global South as well, right, are also taking part in this. So but what I wanted to kind of re-emphasize the collusion and the partnership aspect precisely for those reasons, right? You were the idea that on the one hand, settler colonialism is kind of an independent process as opposed to a very collaborative one. I think it's really important to understand that because you need to get, I think, as total a map of complicity as possible. So I try to kind of front load my usage of the term with that understanding that I'm using it in this particular way. We're seeing a very active partnership, the scale of both repression and hegemony that we're seeing in terms of the global tech sector would not be possible without this active collaboration, and neither would the repression. And it's also important because I think it reorients us to see that what we're experiencing is a matter of choice, right? The issue sometimes with critiques, well, I shouldn't say the issue with critiques, but I think the kind of the direction of critiques sometimes can also imply that it's simply that there's this broader kind of Israeli capture of all of these markets, and that's not exactly true, I would argue. I mean, I do think that there is definitely intense, let's say, sophistication based on testing out these products and these technologies, or we could say adjacent and connected technologies on colonized Palestinians that does give kind of a crude sort of edge, but at the same time there's nothing that makes the acceptance of Israeli colonial technology or kind of technocratic prowess inevitable, right? This is a direct result being made by all of these companies to have these partnerships, or to have these individuals from this cyber surveillance unit so overrepresented in their employment, or to have these people who are also government affiliated Israeli individuals on their boards or in these leading positions of their companies. All of this is a direct result of choice that is made for the company's bottom line. And this, I think this also kind of helps us productively de-exceptionalize some of the tendencies of the tech industry, because we have the same patterns with the the legacy media industry. I mean, of course, if you think about it, right, when we look at concepts like manufacturing consent, or the work of Herbert Schiller that came before that I also draw on, media in general has always been a very powerful hegemonic force that both work to kind of condition political sensibilities to support U.S. imperial violence, and of course the support for the Israeli project is a broader part of that conditioning of support for imperialism, right? It's not an outlier in that; it's directly continuous with that. And it's also been its own, for those reasons, very entrenched industry in terms of kind of having a revolving door between both U.S. governmental as well as kind of broader international collusions, right? So what we're seeing happen now is, I think in many ways, it's just that the current big tech industry is, kind of taking the mantle, from the legacy media before it. But we've always known that these blocks work in this way. So I wanted to emphasize the convergence model, as kind of a reminder that this isn't just, a colonial state gone rogue. This is an active partnership with that colonial state, no matter what it does. Now, to kind of go back to what I was critiquing about some of my maybe misguided idealism, I had sort of stipulated in the book that, at least on a conceptual level, I want to make this clear because, I'm not that naive, but I was just saying that conceptually, if this is a partnership, then there should be a possibility, to play off the, support for colonization on the one hand and the meeting of profits on the other. But, that was misguided on my part because, ultimately it's the partnership with the Israeli state that's the most important thing for these companies. And, I was kind of reminded of that when I was looking through, I think Wendy Liu's Abolish Silicon Valley, where she makes this point basically that tech companies always do things that seem like, in the short sense, that they're not going to be profitable, but they're always done for the long-term interest. And so in this moment, it might seem like, banning all of these users or, throttling your Palestinian users' reach, is going to be less profitable. In a very crude sense, maybe it is because you're losing that one person, but think of the broader interest you're representing, which is this total enmeshment, with a colonial Israeli tech sector that will give you the boon of helping you actively together refine your surveillance prowess, right? Your data mining prowess, your tracking prowess, all of these things, right? The world of possibilities that the Israeli state, through its colonization, opens up to the tech sector in terms of, the potential for domination and control on many levels, I think is very alluring. So, but again, it's not about one space controlling the other. It's rather like a story of an active partnership. And so I would say that had been kind of my emphasis in reorienting the term in the way that I do in the book.
Yeah, thank you for that. So as I mentioned, like one of the things that you talk about in the intro is how, and this comes out throughout the book because it's, as we've laid out all of this, which so far probably to listeners sounds like very ominous, which it in many ways it is. But on the flip side, the book is really also a story of people resisting, right, and resisting these different using these platforms to the extent that they can, running up against the censorship regime of these things, right, and also finding new ways to move forward and so on. But you just talk about how the very history of Palestinians is this resistance to silencing, that ultimately these attempts have never succeeded and won't succeed. Which is not to say that obviously there've been extremely terrible things that have happened to Palestinians that we're seeing, right now in Gaza. And, with this, again, as I mentioned earlier, there's this, recent UN Security Council kind of international colonization going on, which is really kind of a colonization on top of a colonization for the Gaza Strip. And, knowing that history, it puts digital surveillance and repression of Palestinians, which obviously are very important to the project of Zionism, in a particularly interestingly place structurally, because it does demonstrate the kind of inherent incompleteness of efforts like this. So maybe you could talk a little bit about this antagonism between silencing and erasure and Palestinian liberation.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that I kind of have this thread running throughout the book. The story of the Palestinian struggle. I mean, obviously, it has many layers of oppression, right? Of great loss, but it's also one of an inability to silence. No matter what they've been subjected to, Palestinians continue to preserve their stories, their history, and to refuse to surrender this dream of ultimate liberation and a return to their homes, and they refuse to surrender this idea of Palestine itself, that connects all Palestinians, wherever they are, wherever we find ourselves, right? And a part of the work of doing the book was kind of putting that sensibility, I guess, in conversation with both the present and the past. And what I mean by that is that I started to, again, going back to this point of de-exceptionalizing our moment to a certain extent, what we're seeing now in terms of, the ways that Palestinians are employing this savvy usage of various forms of media. And, again, I don't want to minimize the great risk that they've taken to do so. I mean, the hundreds of journalists that have been directly assassinated by the Israeli state, right? It's just, it's astounding, right? But the ways that Palestinians continue to repurpose media to use it for ends that it was never, or it's become increasingly clear it has not been designed to fulfill, is something that Palestinians have always done, right? And that's part of the reason that I draw a connection in I think one of the longer chapters in the book where I talk about kind of the emergence of the internet in Palestine and what that meant for Palestinian resistance messaging. But in that chapter, I also draw a connection between what we saw resistance figures like Hassan Kanafani doing, in terms of how he, had this very really, I'm trying to look for the right word because I don't think anything really captures the experience of watching this clip, but let's say the savvy usage, right, of kind of like turning the interview on its head. And I think you've probably seen this. I'm sure your viewers have seen it. This is the famous clip, from the interview with Richard Carlton, that with the quotes, like, that's a conversation between the sword and the neck. He's asked, why won't you engage in peace talks? He goes, well, you don't really mean peace, you mean capitulation, so on and so forth. And, part of working on the book was realizing that, Palestinians have always had this ability, and it's partly an ability born of necessity, but nevertheless, I think, all of the resistance figures have displayed great skill in this, of taking hegemonic platforms, and repurposing them for counter-hegemonic ends, right? And I think media has always been a space of that. Media, literature have always been sites where Palestinians really cleverly repurposed kind of these broader hegemonic mechanisms to do counter-hegemonic work. And so, to a certain extent, what we're seeing now with social media is just the latest example of that, rather than this anomaly. And so, it's also something that guides what I think is not so much a misinformed idealism, as opposed to maybe my other phases that I had when I was working on this project, is that there's really no way to silence the struggle for Palestinian liberation. And I think in and of itself, that is always going to be a victory. And I don't mean this in like a static sense that means that people, we should just stop doing what we're doing and just that's it. But, look at the great cost that's continuing to maintain this, but not just this genocide, but this, putrid settler colony has had, for the Zionist project. Like, look in terms of at least the broader perception, what it's done to its image. And this time, I think that there's really no way to come back from that. And also look at how, the narrative has really shifted in terms of Palestine and Palestinian liberation. Now, I think there's become a kind of a different form of common sense where you really can't weaponize the language of expertise to dissuade people from understanding that they're seeing a very stark representation of the dynamic of oppressor and oppressed. And so I think in terms of, the narrative, there has been, a really important gain that we shouldn't lose sight of. Because now I think we're at this, kind of bizarre impasse where, the sites of power are continuing to kind of move in the same way, even as the narratives and the popular support has clearly shifted. But it's like the curtain has been drawn back, in a very, very intense way. but I think it's important to continue to think about the story of Palestine as this series of failed silencings, as I refer to it in the book, precisely because, I think there's a lot of what's happening that is unclear, but the one thing that, is very clear is that there's never going to be a secession of, the struggle for a free Palestine. Palestinians will continue to speak out, no matter the odds. And that is one thing that I think is important for us to remind ourselves of and to hold on to, because ultimately I think that's the sentiment that continues to guide resistance in spite of the odds, no matter how insurmountable they seem. And I think it's what continues to inform all of our work as well.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to jump to a question I had a little bit later down, which was there's this interview or this chapter where you're talking to Sam from National SJP. And, I'm paraphrasing, but they talk about how like Israelis and Zionists using social media, have a difficulty because of their assumption of kind of legitimacy and narrative dominance. And um, I mean, it reminded me most recently of this. She's not Israeli, but this like former Hurwitz, this former Obama speechwriter that keeps talking and doing these interviews, and
Yeah.
and she just goes out there and says like really. I mean, I think I can't remember the first. I mean, the first thing that went viral with her recently was her talking about the problem with the way the Holocaust is, taught to people basically, and that, that it makes people think that just because, the Jews were oppressed, that they were the good guys and the Nazis were the bad, like something very, and and then she had another one the other day where she talked about Israel being just like every other state that was founded in the 20th century, which and but you talked about, or Sam in this piece talked about kind of this idea that like there's just kind of this arrogance and this presumption of we're in the position of defining the reality for people. And it, I think especially over the last 2 years, as you were kind of talking about, this has just become more and more kind of cartoonish and caricatured because it's just so out of step with what people can so clearly see. And I wonder, is this I guess this is one of the things that gives me hope kind of in what you're talking about too long term, is this kind of inability to effectively demonize their opposition in the eyes of the world, that even as they use these terms to call everybody a terrorist or whatever they want to say, that like people kind of can just see with their own eyes that this is not the case. But then there's also, I don't know, I mean, I also get caught in sort of the limit of us, without power, right? That there is this kind of problem of like, yeah, the emperor has no clothes, but he still has all the guns or something like that, and so what are some of the things that you were doing in this study that you know um that kind of helped you to avoid falling into defeatism, kind of like this, and what are your thoughts too, I guess, on that problem? I mean, because I think that's one of the things that a book like this kind of begs, is like, with the kind of level of media control and all of these levers of suppression that they have, that even though they can't really they can't really control what we think, they can sort of control what we see. And yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that was such a great insight from Sam, this idea that you have a usage that's very clearly predicated on always being just believed and listened to, versus users who have to do all of the maneuvering to account for how much they're silenced and misunderstood, like misrepresented, right? um that kind of helped me develop some of my own understandings of what Palestinians are doing. You know, and I don't want to mystify this too much, or let's say fetishize this too much, but the when you need to become conversant in forms of media that were really um, basically set to work dehumanizing you, I think that that's at least a double level of achievement, because you're not just becoming conversant in the media, you're also becoming developing these very counterintuitive skills to use this medium to maximum efficiency, to broadcast a message that was never supposed to be broadcast, and to do so in a way that is digestible to all of the potential people who are supposed to just recreate your elimination, your dehumanization. So I just think that the efficacy of various forms of media for those reasons, and even for uncertain purposes, because oftentimes you're sending out messages not knowing who's going to receive them, if you're going to get the help that you need, right? Really shouldn't be understated. But I guess there's a couple of things, because I feel like there are a couple of points raised in that question. The point about defeatism, I think, is such an important one, because we all struggle with it and we all go through moments of it. But one thing that helps me with defeatism is just kind of to remind myself, well, like, who does it benefit if we feel this way? Because if we think about it, resistance is never the practical thing to do. It never makes sense. The most practical thing is always just to go along with what power wants you to do. So I think if we can, when we're at kind of our lower points, ask ourselves, like, well, who does it actually benefit if I give in to this feeling and just do that? It'll kind of reorient, I think, our perception a little bit, which is not to say that you're not going to have moments where you don't feel defeated. And I think it's also important not to pretend, that's not the case too. But I think when we have an understanding of, like, our morale is also something that is being potentially weaponized against us, it can help inform how we show up in our different spaces. And I think you're right. Like, maybe consciousness only goes up to a certain point, because at the end of the day, those with the power to control the media are going to keep trying to make sure that we don't see things that will move us otherwise to action. And if anything, that's only becoming clearer, right? That's that things are moving in that direction. I mean, I finished the book, even before, for example, the current configuration of the TikTok deal, the consolidation of legacy and digital media that you see vis-a-vis the Ellisons, and Barry Weiss. And so it's very clear that they're just locking down all of these centers as much as possible to make sure that nobody sees anything critical of the Israeli project anymore. But, so that means that things are kind of up in the air, but I think we also have to take comfort in the fact that up in the air could also mean positive, because, unpredictability can also slant, in a positive direction. And one thing that I think all of us can agree on is that you'll never unsee what you've seen. Even if somebody stops you from seeing any more of it from this point forward, there's really nothing left, right? There's not one more video that you need to see to be convinced whether, that this is a genocide or that Palestinians are an oppressed people. Even if you're not somebody who, believes or, takes much stock in the colonial model, like as we do, even to that point, I think that at this point, you're not going to be somebody who would discount the fact that Palestinians are facing, really intense forms of oppression. So with all of that, right, there can be all of this escalating narrative control, but what exactly is it going to be doing? Because it's not going to convince us, that this was not a genocide. And so now the question becomes, what are we going to do with that newfound consciousness for many? And how are we going to continue to exert pressure in very unexpected places? I mean, I don't have a full answer for anything, but I think that one of the things that I think has been inspiring to see is, for example, different forms of, direct action and protest, that tech workers have been taking, at their, employers or former employers in many cases. And so I think we just need to continue to think of different ways to exert pressure on these centers of power in ways that they are not expecting. And, again, there isn't necessarily a definitive list of what that could look like, but I think we just need to continue to try to find ways to be as loud, as disruptive as possible, and make it clear that whatever decisions are made in terms of, what is, published or what is no longer allowed to be published, we have this knowledge and many new people have this knowledge, and we're going to continue to act upon it to affect some kind of change and to show, that we're not going to back down, even as you make it clear that you're just going to, turn all of these different outlets into even more intense containers of Israeli propaganda than maybe they were, 2 years ago.
Yeah, appreciate it. I also was reminded as we were talking about this because they did a tweet shouting us out is that the Good Shepherd Collective also they show up in this book multiple times, and so yeah, shout out to Lara and Cody and everybody else there.
Yeah, and they, I will say those were the folks who were showing me their writing, and so they, they were a great inspiration for continuing this book as well, and obviously, I think a lot of us have, been really inspired and informed by, what the Good Shepherd Collective is doing, and not just in terms of, resisting the violence of colonial occupation, but also really helping us navigate some of the contradictions, even in, solidarity that, otherwise we might paper over. So definitely shout out to the Good Shepherd Collective.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to make sure we touch a little bit on Rifat Al-Arir. We had Louis Alday on, a week and a half or so ago, and, give a good reminder of that, one reminded that we're almost to 2 years since he was martyred on December 6th of 2023. But also that, if we don't understand it, Israelis understood how important he was, and how important the work that he did was to Palestinian resistance in Gaza, which is why that they targeted him so early on in the genocide. And you talk about him in the book, and I know, as we referenced in your bio, you worked with, the Eyewitness Palestine, group. And so I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about the impact that he had on Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, not just as a writer, which obviously I think people are more familiar now with some of his writings, but it also just in terms of the capacity of Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, to engage in the kind of digital resistance that they do. And I know, it was not just him, you talk about him alongside several of his peers. But yeah, I would really love to hear you talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think in, the from what I've heard and what I've seen, and I want to make it clear, I'm not necessarily the most representative voice on this, just because I'm not from Gaza myself, but the impact that Rifat had was in many ways, incalculable. I mean, he dedicated, his life and really his intellectual project and life world really was to, cultivating and supporting, new voices, writers from Gaza, many of whom started out as his students. And so, I think of it as kind of a multi-pronged project. On the one hand, there was this kind of relentless process of cultivating new young writerly talent, right? Encouraging students in his classrooms to write about their experiences, to publish their stories. The book Gaza Writes Back, that was released by Just World Books, which he edited and also contributed to, was in many ways a labor of love that emerged from years of working with, all of these young writers and encouraging them to find their voices, as fiction writers. And so, and you have so many of his students who continue to be, former students who continue to be published in things like Electronic Intifada. You continue to have these really important reflections on Rifat's legacy and tributes to him that are, published by, important academics in their own right, like, Yusuf al-Jamal, who was one of the people that I also talked to in the book. But what I do in the book, and again, this was, working through conversations with Yusuf and also with Asim al-Nabi from, the Gaza municipality, was to, and they helped me realize this, but, Rifat had always had this very profound understanding of the power of narrative, right? It can almost sound like a cliche to say that, stories have power, but when you really break it down, right, there is something really profound in that formulation, and that's something that Rifat always worked from, and that's the same kind of power that he helped other people, writers from Gaza realize, through finding their own voices. But essentially, I realized that to a certain extent, maybe I was looking at things backwards, because I was thinking about media and then from there coming to it through narrative. But if we looked at Rifat's insights, the way he reflected on, horrific campaigns like Caste-led, not just what happened there, but then the aftermath of how, people remained resilient and steadfast. And instead of simply succumbing, they committed to preserving and telling their stories, not just to archive the atrocity, but precisely to show that there is a record of people who continue to, who will never leave, who believe in Palestine, and who love their people, their homeland, and will never back down, no matter how oppressive the colonial project becomes. But all of that, as well, is kind of actualized through this understanding of narrative, not just as a humanizing force, but as something that also kind of has a power to remind the broader collective, globally, ultimately, we could say, of how certain dynamics are very familiar. And so, what narrative can do is it can act as the story that kind of gets you to disbelieve the other stories that you might be told, through, outlets like, legacy media, for instance. So it's humanizing, but not in this compromised sense, not in this kind of liberal universalist sense, but it's, through getting people to understand that oppression, is not really exceptional. It actually looks very familiar. So no matter where you are, you're going to recognize it, right? There may be some variables, like, well, where is exactly is this happening? Who is it happening to? What is the language? But in many other ways, this is going to be very, very starkly familiar to you. And the power of a good narrative is it can actualize that response. And so what happens, is that, you have Rifat, who always has this understanding of, the great power of fiction to accomplish this. And, he continues to work with many young writers for many years to get them to also tap into this and to pursue their work in the same way. And then you also have the, developments of social media that are happening around the 2010s. And, a collective of people from Gaza, including Rifat, as well as, his peers, like Asim, like Yusuf, they start to look at different platforms, and together, they go towards Twitter for, there's some contingency reasons, and I mean contingent in terms of just the the socio-political moment. Like, it's interesting, but they'd already kind of recognized that Facebook itself was kind of compromised. They were already being censored on it, even in the 2010s. So this didn't seem to be as viable, but there was something to Twitter. And I think just the fact that it also was such a hub for, other journalists and writers as well as an app, because it was in many ways the first like real-time app, that could be used to, transmit messages, in moments as they're happening. And then there was also, things like the figuring out dynamics of, okay, how many likes or retweets does it take for something to go viral? How do we do a hashtag that can trend? So they have all of this knowledge that they start applying to get things like different attacks, like Gaza under attack, basically, to become trending. And through that, as they told me in conversation, this was one of the ways that they really were able to kind of break out of the narrative embargo that they had been imposed upon by legacy media, and not even necessarily ill-intentioned media, right? Because they were also, like Austin was telling me, like sometimes even Arabic programming, like it wasn't necessarily an ill intent thing, but they just weren't necessarily as aware of how to report on certain things in certain moments. So some of us found ways to actually make things go viral, and that provided, fodder that then other outlets could use to report on. So it was also this process of really working in tandem with different forms of media. But I think the takeaway here is that all of this was really made possible through this, really intentional usage and understanding of the broader power of narrative dynamics that, Rifat had always understood and really worked with other people to develop their understanding of as well. So we're not just looking at, a success in terms of Palestinian usage of social media. We're looking at Palestinian usage of social media that was really honed upon through understanding the broader power of narrative, to really inspire people to reconsider, hegemonic positions and to take action to change accordingly. And so, I think that that's in many ways just one of the important contributions of Rifat, and why his legacy will never be erased. Even despite his cowardly and horrific assassination, by this, really just I don't know, inhuman colonial project in many ways. I think what's going to endure is Rifat, and the story of Gaza and the broader story of Palestinian liberation. As soon as you have the realization of Palestinian liberation, then I think the colonial force in many ways will fully be cast to the dustbin of history, and it's going to be Palestinian resistance, and resilience and steadfastness, that is going to remain the ultimate takeaway and the ultimate message.
Yeah, thank you. I want to move to back to the forward for a minute. Stephen Salaita, wrote the forward. It's beautiful, as folks would expect. And he writes, quote, "More than anything, I hope that readers will assimilate the ultimate lesson of Terms of Servitude. Even if it were designed to be neutral, no technology will magically liberate the oppressed," end quote. And I think that is a really important lesson here, because you are, as we've already talked about, you know, kind of debunking, I don't know how much this still needs to be debunked, but I think it does, because we all are on these apps, particularly because we feel like there is something more free about it, or that, we can get messages or whatever that we're not going to get in the mainstream media. And there is still some truth to that, even as highly, modulated as they are. But I think, um, obviously, Steve is talking there also about, as you talk about in the piece, this notion, which was very much a part of the marketing or the promotion of a lot of these apps and of the internet more broadly, of this excitement of it as kind of a revolutionary technology, right? That had the potential to change everything. Um, and it's interesting in light of now, where, there, you referenced earlier kind of some of the terms of service changes that we've had happen, which I've been paying more attention to. It's been some very significant changes that have happened over the last couple of years, as well as, obviously all the censorship and stuff like that that you're documenting in the book. But one of the things you talk about a little bit in the book too, which I think is really interesting and related to this, is another sort of revolution, quote unquote, that we're in right now, which is these early years of so-called AI, right? Or as you rightly, talk about LLMs. Um, and one of the things I was thinking about is, you don't spend a whole lot of time talking about those technologies, but rather, some of the ways that pro-Palestinian groups have been spreading the narrative, and the ways that they are used for repression. Um, and there's an interview with Nardine Kiswani, and she talks about being worried that social media is becoming more sophisticated in ensuring that people don't see figures or stories of resistance, but only Palestinians as victims. And I guess so. There's her point there, which I think is an important one, and I think it is part of one of the contradictions now, that it's like you have to really actively seek out, for instance, what's going on with the resistance in Palestine, especially armed resistance. But it's much easier to find pictures of Palestinian suffering, kind of everywhere. Um, but on the flip side too, I guess it's not on the flip side, but another aspect of this point is, now we're kind of entering into this world where, is you talked about with that discussion of Rifat and his friends, figuring out at one point on Twitter, what it took to make a hashtag trend, or how many likes and retweets, something needed to, really break through and get, a certain amount of visibility and all of that. And we're really in a stage now, it feels like, where social media is much more conscious of trying to be very sophisticated in suppressing kind of user-based engagement. Meaning, I mean, there was even an article, and I hesitate to bring it up a little bit because I haven't verified, this, but that Musk was considering letting Grok like decide what everybody saw on Twitter, and basically entirely taking away, a like or a repost having any legitimacy in terms of how wide things spread. Basically, that as you logged in, you would just see what, the AI model determined that you should see, and that's kind of how I feel like when I'm on Instagram, is that like maybe I'll see one tweet from, somebody I follow, and then it's a whole bunch of videos that, you know, based on my interests and my likes, will probably make me laugh and share it with somebody, even though, it's like, oh, I'm out of the news world now and into like, funny videos about 40-year-old dads or whatever. So
Yeah.
anyway, there's there's multiple things going on there, but I guess they're both about different ways of kind of mediating what types of things that we see through these apps now.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that that's becoming much more pronounced, and I think that that's what that's what um, the people who run these apps really want. Like, I do think they want to shift us away from politicized engagement towards a much more passive consumer kind of role. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think that's only going to continue to become more refined, and there's going to be a continuous attempt to really incorporate AI with that, to just um, make this as well, in their minds, as efficient as possible. I mean, I think that's the design. Like, how it actually plays out, we'll see. But I think that that's the goal, right? Have this, new technology that will allow you to really set about making sure that your users are just prodded toward a harmless, quote unquote, form of entertainment that's just going to keep you locked on this app more, and ultimately, consuming more, giving more data that can be scraped, to advertise to you. That's what and I think, we can come maybe back to this in a minute, but like, I do recognize that I sort of talk about a before and after in the book, but ultimately that's what these folks have always wanted, right? It's not that people actually wanted to create something that would help people, save the world or whatever other ridiculous thing, they might have said. And, of course, they don't even speak in those terms anymore. They always wanted something that is ultimately going to align people to be, good consumers, good capitalists, and as unthinking as possible. So the political content is always, I think, an issue. So we can only see that, going even more. And I actually think there's an interesting interface here with the the important quote from Nardine that you mentioned, which is that it could also be that there is an idealized type of political content that maybe is less threatening and maybe ends up even being less de-emphasized, which is the content that is really geared around more so-called humanitarian frameworks, or that talks about Gaza and Palestine in this vacuum. Look how sad this is, look what's happening, which I think to some extent is part of the content farms, not all of them, but part of the content farms that Nardine was talking about. Because I know she was also kind of critiquing people who established their clout through Palestinian death and dispossession in general, right? But I do think that there's a way that we could even see political content sort of routed through that broader imperative as well. But again, as you're saying, it's going to be something that's very sanitized, that basically is maybe the visual application of kind of like the passive voice that we see from a lot of these legacy media outlets. So all of which is to say, like, I think we're already seeing AI used in those directions, and that's my ultimate predicament. It's just going to continue to kind of go on those larger patterns, right? So I think it's just we're going to see increasingly exacerbated tendencies that we've already known to be true from using these apps. I think it's just going to feel like it's deteriorating more and more. This is what Cory Doctorow talks about with enshittification. But yeah, I think the politics has always been a challenge because they understand it's what brings people to the app to a certain extent, but they don't want it there. So one response, as we've been seeing, is mass censoring. But I think even as blatant as this has been, there is some kind of calculus somewhere that they can't literally take everybody off the app. And of course, they don't really have the means of doing that, even as they do it as much as possible. But I do think there's some kind of understanding that we know people come for this. So I just think they're going to continue to try to maneuver in such a way as to give people a lukewarm, watered down version of that they feel they can fool people into thinking they've actually come to the app for. Now it's not going to work, for those of us who are looking, at content by people like Sami Doon, for example, as you were talking about, right, with the question of like, anti-imperialist critique, thinking about Palestinian resistance, all of that. It won't necessarily work on us, but I think there's this assumption that maybe it can work on at least some contingent factions of people who support Palestine. Is it going to be effective? Probably not, but I do think that that's one of the, formulations that they're dealing with right now. But absolutely, we're just going to continue to get AI used to kind of, not just censor, but also veer us toward these kind of harmless and just ineffectual, slop, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, no, thank you. There's a chapter I really appreciate in your book where you talk about the kidnapped posters. I think many of us understood these posters were kind of, very much a part of a propaganda project that was about much more than, this idea of, returning the prisoners of war that were held by the Palestinian resistance. What did your writing on them reveal in terms of the role that these posters and kind of the related campaigns and propaganda served throughout this genocide?
Yeah, I think the working on the article that became part of the chapter for the book, it basically confirmed what people in the movement already, as you were saying, intuitively recognized. And unfortunately, what people had actually faced negative consequences over, which is really that these posters were presented in one way, but it's ultimately this kind of gaslighty sort of honeypot, right? Because going through the history of the posters, right, they were created by these two Israeli artists. The project itself was billed as simply a consciousness raising project, but it doesn't take very long to realize that these are basically posters that just reiterate various forms of Israeli propaganda. At some point they were even peddling the lie that there had been mass rape on October 7th, all of these things. So basically they're really just an attempt to repackage Israeli propaganda under this false guise of humanitarian concern. And they were really consistently weaponized as ways to dox people and just basically have them lose their livelihoods, right? I mean, it's no coincidence that you start almost as soon as you see them immediately getting footage of from spaces like stopantisemitism.org, which is basically like the another iteration of what Canary Mission is, or spaces like Jew Belong, which is a registered nonprofit, but that I talk about in another chapter, for helping coordinate a harassment campaign against Palestinian content creators. These spaces and sites start to basically promote the doxing, and harassment of people who take these posters down, rightfully so, because they recognize them to be forms of Israeli propaganda, right? So what I found out really in many ways was, I think, a confirmation of what activists already had intuitively recognized. But I think it was still an important process of information gathering, if only because it was a good reminder that the colonial application of technology also really relies on this interface between the digital and between analog strategies. So in this case, you had a very clearly honed strategy of having these posters put up, and then as soon as people go to take them down, having them be doxxed, and then having these videos kind of go viral through these blacklist sites or through these organizations that disseminate Zionist propaganda regularly. And you have this cross coordination with spaces like Jubalong, or this new one, or at the time new, that was founded, that was called the Jew Hate Database, I believe, and then Stop Anti-Semitism. They're all kind of cross-posting each other and amplifying it to their base, and getting more and more harassments turned on to these individuals. So it was basically, in many ways, I think, an elaborate sort of just ruse to get people doxxed. And of course, the legacy, you had like media outlets too, like the New York Post, were regularly like publishing photos with these people's faces on them. So yeah, you just had this cross media effort to blacklist and to demonize and to dox people. And so while there was this claim that this is simply about consciousness raising, these are forms of Israeli propaganda that were used to intimidate, harass, and dox people. Some of whom even lost their their academic opportunities, lost their jobs. And I think what was also interesting to note, this wasn't my insight, but drawing on reporting from The Intercept, there was a writer who really put these posters in conversation with campaigns that have happened throughout history to draw attention to people who have been disappeared, by repressive regimes. And they said, well, what separates these posters from that is that this is really just an attempt to basically insist upon the exceptionalism of the Israeli context, and to really exceptionalize the right to revenge for purposes of the Israeli project, right? In other moments where you have these genuine attempts to call attention, to horrific cases of political persecution on a collective level, this was really affected through a kind of, humanizing ethos, right? These posters are something that's different, right? It's simply to generate outrage and to make sure that Israel has the monopoly on retribution ultimately. This is not in any way an organic, genuine project rooted in concern. And as I also mentioned in the chapter, I mean, really, the best place to put these posters up is on Israeli consulates, because who was all consistently sabotaging any kind of attempt to get the captives back, because they recognized that it was nothing more than a bargaining chip for them to continue the genocide. It was the Israeli state. So, yeah, I would say ultimately it was just, I think it was a confirmation of what the movement rightfully knew, but it is important, I think, at the same time to name that, if only because at least at that point in the genocide, this was one of the few places where you could kind of see some doubt on people who weren't as informed. They might say, oh, well, why is that bad? They're just saying that these people should be brought home. But then you start to unpack, well, this is simply repackaging propaganda. This is basically artistic rage bait to get people to unthinkingly support the continuation of the genocide, right, rather than actually take concrete actions. I mean, if you're really concerned, again, you need to be pressuring the actual government that's waging the genocide, right, not demonizing Palestinians or activists who rightfully are recognizing that this could is just going to stoke more anger, which is in turn going to lead to more harassment, which is so not necessarily something that people weren't aware of, but I do think that this was one of those contexts where you can have, I think, a particular role as a journalist or as a writer to kind of set the record straight, I think, on what a lot of people might take for granted as being sort of a misguided, acts of resistance, which are in actuality were very important and brave acts of resistance, because people were trying to make sure that these propaganda pieces ultimately don't linger in their spaces, don't continue to kind of generate and maintain this kind of just unthinking, rageful sentiments of the need for total retribution, which was ultimately, manufacturing consent for the continuation of the genocide, no matter what level of atrocity was inflicted.
Appreciated. I know we're kind of winding down a little bit on time, and so I'm going to kind of combine a few things together here, and then you can take up from it what you would like to. But one, so I really appreciated this quote from Edward Said that you pulled out, that he wrote in 2003, which was, quote, "Instead of reading in the real sense of the word, our students today are often distracted by the fragmented knowledge found on the internet and in the mass media." And again, it just stood out in part because it was in '03, which was like when I was an undergrad. And so it which was true then, but I think even nowadays it's like so much more intensified, and it does bring up again this question of LLMs or AI for me too, because it's like if you Google something now, it's not even like very often that you get articles, but you get an AI interpretation of various things that could be blog posts or whatever, right? And so there's that element, which I just think is just a reality that we have to kind of reckon with in terms of what the internet even is at this point. And I think that Edward Said was right about it in 2003, but I also think that it has only gotten that critique has only gotten more, is only more powerful now than it was 20 some years ago. So there's that. And then on the other side, I guess this will hopefully allow you to talk about some different things. But I think that on the flip side, this book also really traces a number of important figures and moments in the Palestinian use of social media developed over the last 20 years. And so there's some really important moments, and you talk about them You've referenced already how they responded to Cast Lead, and then obviously, the Sheikh Jarrah and the Unity Intifada. Obviously, we have now also the experiences of the last couple of years and how, Palestinians have used social media throughout this genocide, even as you said, hundreds of journalists have been killed for doing so. Um, and so it's just an interesting kind of dichotomy, I think, to hold, in which, yes, the internet is just getting shittier and shittier and, more capable of um, censoring and moving perhaps beyond even misinformation and disinformation to kind of a slop era of
Mhm.
the internet. And yet we do have this history also where I think it is important to look at the example of how Palestinians have engaged in social media, because I do think there is a profound shift. I know for myself personally, but I know this is the case for many others, in our understanding of, the Palestinian liberation struggle through the use of Palestinians on social media over the last 20 years, right? That, like, that shift doesn't happen without that. And so, yeah, I guess that gives you a place to kind of take us out of here and think about where to wrap up this conversation.
Yeah, yeah. I loved that quote from Saeed, and then there's another moment in the same piece, basically, where he's also talking about the democratic potential of cyberspace, something like that. I just thought it was so interesting because you already have the dichotomy of the internet, basically, like reflected upon. Um, and so, yeah, I do think that we're at a place where the internet is going to continue to get worse and worse, is getting worse and worse. Um, but I think it really just boils down to a dynamic that basically has always been in place, which is that you have this space and these technologies, and you have people who control them or who oversee them, and I think that that has shrunk over time. But by and large, if you look at the roots of the history of the internet, particularly the internet as we know it today, right, it's always been tied to the military industrial complex for the most part. So the emergence of the internet, the current phase that we have now, with different forms of digital media and platforms, right, they don't emerge in a vacuum from imperialism and imperialist violence. Really, it's the history has always been there. So to a certain extent, you have this technology that has been made possible and is often overseen by the forces of power, and then you have various collectives that are going to use that technology to advance their various struggles, right, for freedom, for liberation, and those two are always going to be in competition. And I think what's happening now is that we're seeing the consequences of the powers that be locking down these spaces and these technologies even more. And of course, part of how they do that is they need to make sure that the space or these technologies really actualize our worst tendencies as much as possible, right? Keep us anxious, keep us depressed, keep us um, you know um, just wanting to look at funny videos all day, or cute videos, whatever, that and they're going to keep doing those things. At the same time, there's always going to be the need to utilize these spaces for, again, to come back to this concept for counter hegemonic purposes. I mean, one of the main reasons, as you're saying, is the fact that so many of us are already on these things, and that's where most of us spend our time. And I appreciated Nardine Kaswani's points about this, where there's such a um, outsized control of these platforms, but at the same time, when you're on them, you're organizing on private property, and they can always pull the rug out from under you. And of course, within our lifetime, has been permanently banned, from Instagram. And at the same time, this is what I also got from the conversation with Sami Dune, is like, for lack of a, for better or worse, most people are also here. All of which is to say, like, I don't think we can or should totally expect people to seed these platforms, but maybe it's time to start thinking of it in kind of a multi-pronged approach where, we seek out as much as we can the content that is done on these platforms, or even we may even use them in ways that are as strategic as possible. But we also start to think about, okay, what are some alternatives to build up our capacity to just start walking away, from these hegemonic sites. So, I think, for example, there's that app Upscrolled that, I believe was started by, I believe, a Palestinian from Australia originally. And, it's an initiative out of, Tech for Palestine, which is an important hub thinking through, anti-colonial potential, tech projects ultimately by various content creators, tech experts, I should say, not just content creators. So I think that, to me, that's kind of the direction that we need to start thinking of moving in. Like, I think the internet is only going to continue to get worse. We can take some comfort in the fact that those tendencies were always there to a certain extent. But I think now, we can also start thinking about the fact that whatever we do on these sites is not going to be the end all be all. How do we just, lock down in such a way as to use them for these purposes when we need to in as streamlined a way as possible, while also continuing to think about how we as a movement build up our alternative potential for having different spaces and different sites that can continue to let us get our messaging out there.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good a plan as any, and it's certainly it's a challenge that, it's like none of us want to be on these specific spaces, but yes, it is also where, we can have conversations and people can see them, right? And people are already on them, and you tell them to go to some new platform that, they don't know about, and, they go there and there's not that many people there. It's just, it's like these real challenges, I think, of how to kind of get there. But I think that it is, I have Upscrolled, and I think it's great that there are these other efforts. And I think, that's the question. And it's also an interesting problem, I think, with this phase too, where there are various versions also of a lot of these platforms too. So even some of the ones that we have been on for a long time, like Twitter, now, X, I hate calling it that, but whatever. But there's Blue Sky now, and there's Threads now, right? And so it's like there's all these different versions, and there's actually not as many people, I think, on a lot of these things as there used to be. Instagram might be the one that, they may still, and Facebook too, although that's a whole different thing. But I think a lot of them have lost a lot of their, and I think it's partly due to some of what you're talking about in the book, is that some of these decisions around suppression and around promotion of, whatever far right politics and things like this, like, they turn people off and cause them to then seek alternatives, which is, I think, good in some level. But then you also produce an issue where you have, fewer and fewer users to connect with, and then, you have to deal with the algorithm at the new space or whatever. And so, I think I love efforts to build kind of anti-colonial, tech and projects that are really conscious about, the kind of suppression and those political questions. So yeah, that's great. This has been wonderful. I definitely encourage people to pick up Terms of Servitude. It's a great time, to buy one for, your friends or yourself at holidays and so on. Is there anything else that you want to say, Omar, as we kind of, wind down?
Just, thank you for this great conversation. I don't have anything else to promote myself, but I would say definitely, continue to donate to the Samir Project and support their work. I think that's really important. And, thank you shout out to Che. Thanks for making the connection. He's not in AMED studies, but we teach together in race and resistance studies also at San Francisco State. So,
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, and I would just also underscore and underline donating to the Samir project right now. The flooding, if people weren't on social media the last couple of days, the videos coming out of Gaza, it's just devastating, and so many people who have done what little they can to often build a new home in a tent. Basically, it's just been all washed away for a lot of them, and so there's just a lot of support again that people need, and it's really important for people to understand that the so-called ceasefire is not, it's not shifting the kind of material realities on the ground for everyday Palestinians in Gaza, other than fewer people are being bombed every day, but it's still, people are definitely in need. And I also want to shout out folks. I know a lot of people, there's a campaign for Doa Osama that I've lifted up a few times and that we even talked about in one of our lives. And due to the support of people, not only has she been able to get an apartment in Gaza, but her sister was able to pay her university fees and, she just graduated and to go to university. So um,
That's amazing.
yeah, it's just I just want to shout people out for doing that, because it's really, it's, even if we're just helping a few people, at least we are. And so thank you folks for doing that. And thank you again for this conversation. It was great. I really do encourage people to pick up the book. It's good stuff, and a lot of, again, as I mentioned, several millennials guests show up in the book as well. So yeah, thank you for your work, and it's been a great conversation.
Thank you so much. Take care.
All right, you too.